It was a quiet afternoon, the kind I had come to cherish after years of teaching. When I looked up from my tomato plants and saw her, she was standing at the edge of my property, her arms crossed, her face twisted in displeasure, a pair of designer sunglasses perched on her nose. She didn't belong here, and that was the first thing I could tell. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp. "You can't grow food here. This isn't some country bumpkin neighborhood." I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "Actually, I can," I replied. "This land has been a farm for over 50 years." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze growing colder. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield," she said, "president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association. Your farm violates at least 6 of our community guidelines." Her words stung like a slap in the face. Farm? I hadn't thought of it that way before, but her scornful tone made it sound as though she had just condemned something foul. "I bought this place 6 months ago," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "I saved every penny from 30 years of teaching. 5 beautiful acres on the edge of Maple Creek Estates with rich soil, perfect for growing organic vegetables. This is my retirement dream." Eleanor's face turned red. "Your farm," she spat as though the word tasted bitter on her tongue, "doesn't belong here. I'll have you know it violates several of our HOA rules." "My property isn't part of your HOA, I said, trying to keep my cool. "Check your maps. This land is zoned agricultural, and it was here long before your development." She fumbled with her phone, snapping photos of my garden beds as though they were some sort of crime scene. "These weeds are an eyesore," she declared, her voice dripping with disdain. "The neighbors are complaining about bugs and smells. This is hurting property values." I straightened my back, my frustration growing. "These aren't weeds," I said firmly. "These are organic vegetables worth thousands of dollars. There are no smells and I don't have livestock." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "We'll see about that," she muttered. "Expect an official notice soon." With a final glare, she turned on her heel and stomped away, her pristine white shoes leaving an indelible mark on the ground as she walked. I watched her leave, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. I had heard the horror stories about overbearing HOAs, but I never thought I'd be the one caught in their crosshairs. That night, after a long day of planting and tending to my crops, I dug out my property papers. I spread them out across the kitchen table, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The deed clearly showed my 5 acres were outside HOA boundaries and zoned for agricultural use. I took photos of every page, just in case. 3 days later, I found an official-looking envelope stuck to my door. Inside, it was a notice demanding that I remove all agricultural activities within 14 days or face fines of $100 per day. The notice cited approved landscaping and neighborhood aesthetic standards. I called the county records office immediately. "Yes, Mr. Davis," the clerk confirmed. "Your property is zoned agricultural. The HOA has no jurisdiction over your land." Relief washed over me. "Could you send me official documentation, please?" I asked, feeling a little better. I decided to write a polite but firm response to the HOA, explaining their mistake in attaching copies of my zoning documents and property maps. I hand-delivered it to their office, making sure to keep a copy for myself. A week passed without response, and as I was harvesting bell peppers, my neighbor Jeff from down the road stopped by. "Thought you should know," he said, leaning on the fence. "They were talking about you at the HOA meeting last night. That Eleanor woman has it out for you." "What did she say?" I asked, offering him a fresh pepper. Jeff took it with thanks. "She kept calling your place the eyesore farm. Some folks agreed with her, but others pointed out you're not even in the HOA territory. They mentioned your letter with zoning documents, though." "Nope," Jeff replied, taking a bite of the pepper. "Eleanor acted like she never got anything from you." My jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. I delivered it myself." "Watch your back," Jeff warned. "She's got some board members wrapped around her finger. They're planning something." Later that day, I installed 4 security cameras around my property. It cost more than I wanted to spend, but Jeff's warning left me uneasy. It was a good decision, as I would soon find out. 2 days later, the cameras caught something I never expected to see. 3 people in matching polo shirts, marked HOA Landscaping Committee, walking around my property. They were taking photos, making notes, and pulling up some of my carrot tops as if they were inspecting weeds. And to make it worse, they had left my vegetables exposed to the hot sun. I was at the farmer's market when it happened, so I didn't see them myself, but I immediately checked the footage when I got home. There, in full view of the camera, was Eleanor leading the group, pointing at my rows of vegetables, speaking animatedly. Her angry gestures were unmistakable. I couldn't believe it. They were trespassing on my land again, and they had done so with the intent to damage my crops. I printed still images from the video and added them to the growing pile of documentation I was carefully assembling. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The next morning, there was another notice on my door. This one declared my property a public nuisance and retroactively increased the fines to $250 per day. Eleanor had even handwritten at the bottom, "Perhaps now you'll take us seriously." I felt my blood boil as I read the words. How dare they? They had no right to enter my property, and now they were trying to use that same trespassing as an excuse to bully me into submission. I called my lawyer, Sarah, and explained everything. "Don't pay a cent," she advised immediately after hearing my story. "They're hoping you'll crack under pressure. Their notices mean nothing since you're not under their jurisdiction. Just document everything and send another letter, this time by certified mail." So that's what I did. I posted no trespassing signs around my property and sent a second firmer letter to the HOA office, once again explaining that they had no legal standing here and demanding they cease all harassment. I made sure to send it via certified mail this time. 3 quiet days passed, and I started to hope that maybe they had finally gotten the message. But then, I woke up to the sound of machinery outside. Rushing out in my pajamas, I saw a landscaping truck parked on the road, with 2 men in uniforms approaching my tomato beds with weed trimmers. My heart sank. Were they actually trying to destroy my crops now? "Stop right there," I shouted, running toward them. "This is private property." The men looked at each other, clearly confused. "We have orders from the Maple Creek HOA to clean up this area," one of them said, showing me a work order with Eleanor's signature. "This property is not part of Maple Creek," I said firmly, pointing to the new "no trespassing" signs I had put up. "Please leave immediately." They hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. I pressed on. "I don't blame you for doing your job, but there's a boundary dispute here, and if you cut down my crops, you could be liable for damages." That did the trick. They apologized and drove off, but not before I took photos of their truck and the work order. As I stood there, my hands shaking with anger, I couldn't believe how far Eleanor and the HOA were willing to go. I immediately called Sarah again. "This has gone beyond harassment," I said, my voice thick with frustration. "This is attempted destruction of property." "I think it's time to go on the defensive," Sarah replied. "Let me draft a cease and desist letter. In the meantime, make your boundaries crystal clear. They've already committed trespassing by entering your property without permission." I followed her advice and installed bright orange survey markers along my property line, reinforcing the boundaries they were so determined to ignore. I also set up a trail camera hidden in a tree, covering the area the landscapers had targeted. The sun was setting by the time I finished. As I stood there, surveying my farm, my neatly organized rows of vegetables and the fruit trees I had worked so hard to plant, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. Eleanor wasn't just trying to push me off my land. She was trying to destroy my livelihood, and I wasn't going to let her. But what I didn't know was that her next move would force me to fight not only for my property rights, but for everything I had worked so hard to build. It was a calm morning when everything changed. I was in the middle of harvesting my heirloom tomatoes when my phone rang. It was Sarah, my lawyer. Her voice was urgent. "Don't go near your farm," she warned. "They've crossed a line. I think you need to call the police." I didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "Just trust me," she said, and there was an undeniable seriousness in her tone. "Something's happening." I felt the tension in my stomach tighten as I hung up. I grabbed my keys, locked up the house, and sped down the road toward my farm. When I pulled in, I nearly slammed into a car parked on the side of the road, and that's when I saw them. Eleanor, Thomas Jenkins, the HOA treasurer, and 5 others, all wearing those damn HOA polo shirts. They were gathering my vegetables, my tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, early potatoes. They had baskets, and they were filling them with the fruits of my labor, stealing everything in sight. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I grabbed my phone and started recording. "Stop right there," I shouted, rushing toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" Eleanor turned, her face an arrogant mask of indifference. "Oh, we assumed," she began in that infuriatingly calm voice, "that since you refused to maintain your yard properly, all this food was going to waste." The audacity of her words hit me like a slap. She was standing there directing her crew as they filled basket after basket with my produce. Hundreds of dollars worth of vegetables, all stolen. "This is private property," I shouted, my anger flaring. "You're trespassing, and you're stealing from me." Thomas Jenkins, the HOA treasurer, didn't even look up as he casually bit into one of my tomatoes, juice dripping down his chin. "These are really good tomatoes," he mumbled, chewing, as though nothing was wrong. "You're stealing from me," I repeated, my voice trembling with rage. "This is my livelihood. You have no right to be here." Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "We're the HOA. We have every right to enforce community standards. Frankly, this eyesore needs to go." "Not only are you trespassing," I shot back, "but now you're stealing my crops. I've called the police." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "You can't be serious," she sneered. "This is just some vegetables. Not like they're worth anything." "Thousands of dollars," I shouted, pointing at the rows of my crops. "That's how much they're worth, and it's my hard work that went into growing them." "We're helping ourselves to what you clearly don't value," Thomas said, his tone dismissive. "I value it," I yelled. "This is my farm, my livelihood, and you're stealing from me. I've had enough of this." At that moment, I pulled out my phone and started filming. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The police would need evidence. Eleanor turned to leave, waving her hand dismissively. "Whatever. You'll be receiving another citation and fine for multiple violations," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "I suggest you comply quickly before things get worse." I wasn't going to comply with their ridiculous demands. This wasn't about a few misplaced vegetables. They had crossed a line, and they needed to be held accountable. As Eleanor and her crew walked away, the police arrived. Officer Martinez, who had already been involved in some previous disputes with the HOA, stepped out of the squad car, looking confused at the scene before him. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the situation. "They're stealing my crops," I said, my voice cracking. "I have them on video." Eleanor quickly stepped in, trying to spin the story. "We were simply conducting a routine inspection of community grounds and removing unhealthy plants that were attracting pests." "This is not your property," I countered, holding up my phone to show the footage of them filling baskets with my vegetables. "I've called the police. You're trespassing, and you're stealing from me." Officer Martinez looked at the footage, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, Mr. Jenkins, this is not a community inspection. This is theft." Eleanor's smug expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "This is a private matter between the HOA and a property in violation of our standard," she said. But the uncertainty in her voice was obvious. I was done arguing. "I'm pressing charges," I stated firmly. "This is criminal trespassing and theft." "I don't think this needs to go any further," Thomas Jenkins said, his voice nervous now. "We were just trying to help out." "I don't need your help," I snapped. "Get off my property. You've stolen from me once too many times." Sarah pulled up at that moment, stepping out of her car with a confident stride. "I'm Mr. Davis's attorney," she announced, walking up to the group, "and I suggest the HOA members return all stolen property immediately and leave the premises." Eleanor's face went red with fury, but she said nothing. Officer Martinez stepped forward, addressing Eleanor and Thomas. "You've heard the lady. Return the produce and leave now." Eleanor turned on her heel, her voice seething. "This isn't over," she hissed. And with that, they left, the stolen produce abandoned at the edge of my property. Officer Martinez took my statement and collected copies of the security footage. "I've dealt with this HOA before," he said quietly. "They're known for pushing boundaries. I'll file the report, but the district attorney will decide whether to pursue charges." I watched them leave, feeling a mix of relief and rage. Eleanor had crossed every line imaginable, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I had fought for my property for months, and now I was fighting for my dignity. The next day, the battle would escalate even further. but I was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the theft were a whirlwind of legal work and tension. I had hoped that the police report, coupled with the video footage, would be enough to make Eleanor and the HOA back off. But I quickly realized that this wasn't going to be that simple. The first sign that things were far from over came when I received another envelope from the HOA. My heart sank as I opened it, already dreading what might be inside. It was a citation, but this time, the fine had been bumped up again, now to $500 per day for violating community standards and refusing to remove non-approved landscaping. The citation also threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't comply within 30 days. I was furious. These fines were piling up, and the HOA was relentless. They had no jurisdiction over my land, no right to impose these rules on me, and yet they were trying to make my life a nightmare. It felt like a war of attrition, a fight where they were hoping I'd buckle under the weight of their endless notices and intimidation tactics. I called Sarah right away. "They're increasing the fines again. I can't keep up with this. What do I do now?" "Stay calm," she said, her voice firm but reassuring. "They're trying to wear you down, but we have the law on our side, and if they continue this nonsense, it'll only help your case when we take them to court." It was easier said than done. I spent the next few days gathering every document, every photo, every piece of evidence I could find. I took more pictures of my land, the signs I'd posted, the security footage showing the trespassing landscapers, and the stolen crops. I had everything neatly organized in a folder, ready for whatever came next. Then just as things seemed to settle, I was hit with another surprise. A week after the police had been involved, I was walking back to the farmhouse when I noticed a strange car parked by the road. It wasn't anyone I recognized. As I got closer, I saw a man in a suit talking to one of the neighbors. When he saw me approaching, he quickly turned away, and my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, waved me over. "Hey, Mr. Davis," she called. "This gentleman here is from the Maple Creek HOA. He's been talking to everyone around the neighborhood about you." The man stepped forward, extending a hand with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Davis," he said smoothly. "I'm Brian McAllister, and I've been hired to represent the HOA in a more formal capacity. It seems we've had some misunderstandings with your property, and we're looking to resolve them amicably." I didn't trust him. The way he was speaking, as though he was offering a truce when nothing about this situation felt even remotely peaceful, only made my suspicions grow. "What do you mean by resolve?" I asked, crossing my arms. "As far as I'm concerned, this whole situation is over. I've shown you all the documentation proving this land is agricultural and not part of your jurisdiction. You have no right to continue these threats." Brian's smile didn't waver. "Well, Mr. Davis, the HOA is very concerned about the visual integrity of the neighborhood, as well as potential impacts to property values. We understand that you might not be aware of the full scope of your actions, but we're hoping to avoid further escalation." "Escalation?" I repeated, incredulous. "You've already stolen my crops, trespassed on my property, and sent me countless citations. If you want to escalate this, be my guest. But you're on the wrong side of the law." His eyes flickered with something, annoyance or maybe fear, but he quickly recovered. "We simply want to come to a mutual agreement. Perhaps we can work out a deal where your farm becomes a community garden. That way, everyone wins. The HOA gets to manage the aesthetics, and you can still grow your vegetables." The offer was laughable. "A community garden?" I scoffed. "You've already stolen my vegetables. What makes you think I'd agree to work with you?" "I'm just offering a solution," Brian said. "If you want to keep fighting, that's your choice. But we have a lot of influence, Mr. Davis. We could make your life quite difficult if this goes on." I didn't hesitate for a second. "Then I guess it's time to make your life difficult, too." Brian's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see how things go," he said, before walking away without another word. The nerve of these people. I couldn't believe the audacity of the HOA trying to force me into a community garden deal after everything they had done. They thought they could simply push me around because they held some power within their gated community. But I wasn't about to back down. That night, I sat with Sarah again, going over the latest developments. I'm not negotiating with them, I said firmly. I've already lost too much. My crops, my peace of mind. I'm taking this all the way. Sarah nodded in agreement. Good. We're preparing for the legal fight, but we need to keep gathering evidence. The more documentation we have, the stronger our case will be. The next day, I contacted the county zoning office and requested all the official documents related to any zoning changes or applications in my area. Something told me this wasn't going to end with just the HOA's harassment. They had a bigger game plan in motion. Sure enough, the following morning, I received an email confirming my suspicions. There had been an application filed by the HOA, specifically by Thomas Jenkins, for a zoning change. The goal? To rezone my property from agricultural use to residential, which would allow for further development in the area. They were trying to take my farm away from me. I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me, but I quickly shook it off. This was it. This was the real fight. They weren't just attacking my crops. They were trying to take my land, my livelihood. But they didn't know what they were up against. I had everything I needed now, all the proof I needed to fight back. The county records, the security footage, the trespassing evidence, and now I had a target. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a fight for everything I had worked for, and I wasn't about to let them take it from me. With everything in place, I knew the next step was clear. It was time to hit back harder. The war was just beginning, and I wasn't going to lose. The tension in the air felt heavier than ever. With the discovery of the zoning application, everything had shifted. This wasn't just about vegetables, fines, or trespassing anymore. They were trying to take my land. It was personal now. I spent the next few days preparing for what would be the most intense fight of my life. My lawyer, Sarah, was working tirelessly, pulling all the strings she could, making sure every document was in order, every strategy mapped out. The zoning change application had been filed by none other than Thomas Jenkins, an attempt to bulldoze my farm and turn it into residential land. But that wasn't going to happen. Not on my watch. I couldn't believe how far they'd gone. I had started this journey with the simple dream of living peacefully, growing organic vegetables, and selling them at the farmer's market. Now I was facing down the full force of a corrupt HOA, with their deep connections and endless resources. But the one thing they didn't have was the truth, and I was going to use it to my advantage. That evening, Sarah called me with important news. We've got them, she said, her voice calm but with an edge of excitement. I've filed a formal complaint with the county about the zoning application, and I've reached out to the press. They're already interested in covering the story. I felt a surge of relief. Finally, we were taking the fight to them. We weren't just going to sit back and let them roll over us. The next morning, the local newspaper showed up at my farm. Jenny Kim, the reporter who had been covering local HOA issues, arrived with her camera crew. I gave her a quick rundown of everything that had happened, from the harassment to the theft, to the attempts to force me off my land. She was appalled, and her team immediately set up to capture the story. Jenny was determined to get the truth out there, and I could see it in her eyes. As she interviewed me, she took photos of my farm, my crops, the damage the HOA had done. She asked tough questions, ones I was more than ready to answer. Why do you think the HOA is going this far? She asked, her pen poised over her notebook. They want my farm, I replied. Thomas Jenkins, one of the HOA board members, has been trying to push for development here for months. He couldn't buy me out, so now they're trying to force me out by any means necessary. She raised an eyebrow. And how do you feel about that? I feel like they've crossed every line imaginable, I said, my voice growing stronger. But I'm not backing down. This is my land, and I've worked too hard for them to just take it from me. Jenny nodded, taking it all in. She could sense the passion in my words, and I knew she would make sure the story got the attention it deserved. By the time the interview was over, Jenny had enough material for a full article, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. This story is going to blow up, she said with confidence as she packed up her camera gear. It's exactly the kind of thing that people need to hear. As she left, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The media coverage would be huge. The HOA's actions were no longer just a personal issue. They were a community issue. People were starting to see what they were really about. Later that day, I received another notice from the HOA. But this time, it wasn't just another fine or citation. This was something different, a formal notice from their attorney threatening legal action. They were suing me for unapproved commercial activity and claiming that I was violating residential aesthetic standards. They had clearly seen the media coverage, and now they were coming at me with everything they had. The threats didn't faze me, though. If anything, they only solidified my resolve. I wasn't going to let them win by bullying me into submission. I had a legal team, I had the press, and I had a community of neighbors who were starting to stand with me. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was ours. The following week, Sarah and I were back in the courthouse. We had all the evidence we needed: the zoning documents, the security footage of the trespassing landscapers, the police report, the media coverage. We were ready to make our case. The courtroom was tense. Eleanor Whitfield, Thomas Jenkins, and the rest of the HOA board were sitting across from us, looking smug as ever. But they had no idea what they were in for. Sarah stood up, calm and collected, ready to present our case. "We've heard a lot of allegations today," she began, her voice steady. "But what we have here are the facts. Mr. Davis's farm has been legally zoned as agricultural land for over 50 years. The HOA has no jurisdiction over this property. What they've been doing, harassing my client, trespassing, stealing his crops, and trying to change the zoning, goes far beyond community standards. It is an attempt to force Mr. Davis off his land, and we have the proof to back it up." She played the security footage, showing the HOA members taking my crops, cutting through my irrigation lines, and destroying my sign. The room was silent as the evidence mounted. Then Sarah pulled out a bombshell, the testimony from Angela Winters, the former HOA secretary, about how Eleanor and Thomas had planned to force me out after their development proposal had been rejected. The courtroom was stunned. Eleanor's face turned pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes as the evidence piled up against her. "This isn't just a case about property rights," Sarah continued. "It's a case about abuse of power, theft, and harassment. The HOA has tried to destroy my client's livelihood and his peace of mind, and it's time they face the consequences for their actions." By the time we were done, the judge didn't need any more convincing. "I've seen enough," she said, looking directly at Eleanor and Thomas. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The HOA will pay $443,500 in damages for destroyed crops, emotional distress, and legal fees." Eleanor's face was a mixture of rage and disbelief. Thomas was staring at the floor, his confidence shattered. The judge wasn't done yet. "I'm also issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting any HOA member from entering the plaintiff's property without written permission." As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Eleanor's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge silenced him with a single, sharp look. The truth had won. And with that victory, I knew the fight wasn't over, but the tide had finally turned. Outside the courthouse, I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. I had stood my ground, and it had paid off. The community garden idea had been put on hold, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I drove home, I knew that this battle wasn't just about legal victories. It was about something deeper, about standing up to people who think their power gives them the right to trample over others. The war might have ended for now, but the fight for justice would never be over, and I would always be ready to stand up for what was mine. The courtroom had given me a sense of justice, but it was the quiet moments afterward that truly began to show the depth of the impact this battle had caused. For weeks, I'd been in a constant state of fight or flight, reacting to every notice, every trespass, every threat with determination and fury. But now, with the judge's ruling in my favor, I found myself wondering what came next. I had won, but what did that victory really mean in the long term? The answer came in unexpected ways. A few days after the court decision, I found myself walking through the rows of vegetables I had so carefully cultivated. The sun was warm, the soil rich with the promise of a new harvest, and the familiar scent of earth and plants filled the air. My farm, my sanctuary, was healing from the scars of the past months. Yet there was a lingering question that gnawed at me. How would this experience change things with the community? I had expected to be done with the HOA after the ruling. I thought they'd leave me in peace, retreating to their suburban bubble. But life doesn't always play out according to our plans. The battle had only been won in the courtroom. Now I would have to face the consequences of standing up to people with far-reaching influence. The HOA members were powerful, but what about the residents who supported them? What did they think about me now? My answer came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor, knocked on my door. I had gotten to know her well over the past few months. She was one of the few people in the neighborhood who seemed genuinely supportive of my farm, even when the HOA had been at its worst. I opened the door to find her holding a bag of fresh tomatoes, her face beaming with a smile. "I thought you might like these," she said, handing me the bag. "I just picked them from my garden." I was taken aback, and my surprise must have shown. "Oh, wow, thanks, they look amazing." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped inside, and I could see the warmth in her eyes. "I saw the article in the paper about the court case," she said softly, "and I just wanted to say that I'm glad you stood your ground. A lot of us around here felt like the HOA was getting too controlling, but we didn't know how to help." I blinked in surprise. "You felt that way?" She nodded, looking around my kitchen with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "You'd be surprised how many of us agree with you. I know some of the neighbors were afraid to speak up, but there's been a lot of talk. People are seeing the truth now, and not just from what you did, but because of the news coverage." I felt a tightness in my chest, a mixture of relief and hope. "That's good to hear." "I'm glad you didn't just give up," she continued. "Some of us wanted to, but we didn't know how to fight back. Eleanor made it look like she had everyone under her control, but I think a lot of us are seeing her for what she really is now." "That's the hope," I said, my voice tinged with cautious optimism. "But it's not over yet." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. "It's not. But you've made a difference, Mr. Davis. A real one." That was the turning point. It wasn't just about the court case or the fines anymore. My stand had sparked something in the neighborhood, a ripple effect that was growing stronger every day. A few days later, I got an unexpected knock at the door again. This time it was Mr. Ramirez, the new interim HOA president. He looked different, less confident, more humble. When I opened the door, he smiled awkwardly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he began. "I just wanted to come by and apologize for the actions of the previous board. We've been meeting, and there's a lot of regret over what happened. I think we could have handled things better, and I'd like to extend an olive branch." I was stunned. "Apologize?" "Yes," he said. "I know it's been a rough few months, and the whole HOA has been under scrutiny. Some of the residents, especially those who didn't agree with Eleanor's actions, have come forward, and they want to make things right." I crossed my arms, skeptical but curious. "And what does that mean for me?" "Well," Mr. Ramirez said, "we're proposing a community garden partnership between your farm and interested residents. Many people are interested in learning more about organic farming, and we'd like to offer volunteer labor and resources in exchange for some produce. With your permission, of course. It would help bridge the gap between you and the neighborhood." I was silent for a moment, considering. The idea of working with the HOA, even after everything they had put me through, was a tough pill to swallow. But there was something in his voice that made me pause. He wasn't pushing me. He was offering a chance for reconciliation, for cooperation. And after everything I had gone through, the idea of bringing the community together in a way that respected my land felt like a good step forward. I looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I'll consider it." "Thank you," he said, relief flooding his expression. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I believe it could be good for everyone, and we'll make sure everything is done properly within the bounds of the law." As he left, I sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the situation settling over me. What had started as a fight to protect my land was slowly evolving into something bigger. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about healing, about rebuilding what had been broken, and about finding a way to move forward. Over the next week, I received more visits. Neighbors, both familiar and new, stopped by to offer support. Some brought food, others brought offers of help with the farm. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a feeling that maybe the farm wasn't just mine anymore. Maybe it was starting to become the heart of something much larger than I had ever imagined. I began working with Mr. Ramirez in the HOA to plan the community garden. It wasn't easy, but slowly, trust began to rebuild. The first few volunteer days were full of awkwardness, but by the time the fall crops started to sprout, something remarkable had happened. Neighbors who had once viewed me as an outsider now treated me as one of their own. The changes were small at first, little chats over the fence, a few shared vegetables, a feeling of unity beginning to blossom. It was exactly what I had wanted when I first set out to create a peaceful, sustainable life. Only now, that dream was shared, and it felt like a victory, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. In the end, it wasn't just my farm that had survived. It was the sense of community that had grown from the fight. And that, more than anything, was the harvest I would cherish for years to come. As autumn descended on my farm, the once peaceful hum of the harvest was now tinged with something more profound, a sense of change, of healing, of new beginnings. The community garden project, which had started as a reluctant compromise, was now becoming a symbol of unity. Volunteers from Maple Creek Estates, some of them once my harshest critics, were now working alongside me to cultivate the land. The rows of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers were growing with a renewed sense of purpose. What was once a solitary, labor-intensive pursuit had transformed into a collaborative effort. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid eye contact were now stopping by to share gardening tips or ask about the best way to grow heirloom varieties. And it wasn't just the people I had known for years who were showing up. Mrs. Rodriguez had rallied some of the younger families in the area, families who had been silent during the HOA debacle. Now they were getting their hands dirty, pulling weeds and picking vegetables with smiles on their faces. Every Saturday, a small group of us would meet for what had come to be known as Garden Day. It was informal, more of a social gathering than a rigid workday. I couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in how the neighborhood was starting to view farming. No longer as an eyesore, but as a gift to the community. There were even some residents who expressed interest in purchasing my organic produce directly from the farm, bypassing the farmer's market entirely. They wanted to support local, real food from someone they knew and trusted. One late afternoon, as I was setting up my roadside stand, I saw Mr. Ramirez walking up the dirt path to my farm. He was holding a clipboard, and for a brief moment, I thought the HOA was back with more complaints. But when he got closer, he waved with a broad smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said, his voice carrying a hint of lightheartedness I hadn't heard from him before. "Not at all," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. "What's going on?" "Well," he began, glancing around at the growing crops and the volunteers working nearby, "I wanted to talk to you about something a little unusual." "Unusual," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Mr. Ramirez nodded. "I've been speaking with a few of the residents, and it seems that there's been a shift in the way people see the farm. And you too. The HOA may have made a mess of things, but I think we're ready to start over. We've got an idea." I felt a knot form in my stomach. What kind of idea? "How would you feel about taking over the management of the community garden? Not just as a volunteer," he said quickly, "but in a more official capacity. The board has been discussing it, and they want to offer you a position to oversee the garden's operations. They think it's time to make things right, to show that the HOA can support local farmers and the community." I stood there dumbfounded. After everything that had happened, the theft, the harassment, the legal battle, this felt surreal. I had spent months fighting for my right to exist on this land, to grow my crops in peace, and now the very people who had tried to force me off my property were offering me an official role in managing the community garden. I shook my head, not sure if I could trust it. "You want me to—" "What? Run the garden?" "Yes," Mr. Ramirez said, his voice steady. "It would be your project. We'd provide the resources, tools, funding, whatever you need, and you'd be in charge of the day-to-day operations. We want to support local food production and ensure that our community grows in a way that's sustainable and respectful of everyone's property rights. What do you think?" I glanced around at the people tending the crops, the families now spending time together, sharing knowledge, building something real. I thought of the future of my farm and how it had become more than just a place to grow food. It had become a symbol of something greater. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the bridge between my farm and the community. I'll consider it, I said, feeling a strange sense of peace settle in my chest. But I need to think it through first. This isn't just about running a garden. It's about restoring trust and showing that we can work together despite everything that's happened. Mr. Ramirez smiled, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of sincerity in his eyes. Take your time, but just know that the offer is real. We want you to be a part of what's coming next for this neighborhood. He handed me the clipboard with some paperwork attached, then turned to leave, but not before adding, "And thank you for sticking with us through all of this. It hasn't been easy, but I think we're on the right path now." That evening, after the sun had set and the last volunteer had gone home, I sat on the porch, the clipboard in my hands. The idea of working alongside the HOA still felt strange, almost impossible. They had done so much harm, and it seemed like a betrayal to everything I'd fought for. But when I looked out at the garden, at the plants growing strong, I realized that the farm had become something bigger than just my battle. It had become a place where people were coming together, building connections, and learning from one another. This might be my chance to make sure that it stayed that way, to lead in a way that made sure no one else would have to fight the way I had. And so, after a long night of contemplation, I made my decision. I would take the position, not for them, but for the farm, for the community, and for the future of sustainable farming in Maple Creek. It wasn't about letting go of the past. It was about making sure the future could be better, not just for me, but for everyone. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most unexpected victories. The farm was no longer just a place to grow food. It was a place to grow something far more valuable: community. And that was the harvest I'd been working toward all along. It had been several months since I'd taken on the role of overseeing the community garden. The transition had been far from easy. Some of the old guard in the neighborhood had been skeptical, unsure if they could trust the new direction the HOA was taking. But slowly, things began to change. We started small, weekly garden meetings where we could share tips and work together, followed by occasional community dinners made with the produce from the garden. There were bumps along the way, of course, but the more we worked side by side, the more the division between us and them seemed to fade. I had expected a lot of resistance when I took over, especially from those who had supported Eleanor and the old HOA board. But to my surprise, many of them came around. Perhaps it was the steady flow of fresh vegetables. Perhaps it was the sense of connection that grew as people shared in the work of the garden. But whatever the reason, it was clear that the shift in the community was genuine. The most unexpected transformation occurred when families who had once been hesitant to step onto my farm started to gather here, in the very place where we'd once fought tooth and nail over boundaries. They would show up on Saturday mornings to dig in the dirt, plant seeds, and work together towards something greater than just a few individual gardens. The community spirit grew stronger with every weed pulled, every row planted, every meal shared. But the real turning point came when, one Saturday, Mr. Ramirez and a few other former HOA members came to me with an offer that completely changed the course of the garden's future. "We've been talking," Mr. Ramirez said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "The new board wants to formally recognize the community garden as a central part of Maple Creek Estates. We're going to designate a permanent space for it, and we want to extend the invitation to make it an even bigger project, one that can provide food to local charities and hospitals, support farmers markets, and even sponsor educational programs for kids. We want you to continue leading it." My heart swelled with pride, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel truly hopeful about the future. They weren't just offering me a position, they were offering me a chance to expand the farm's mission, a chance to use the land not only for personal growth, but for the growth of the entire community. I took a deep breath, looking out over the rows of crops that had once felt like a battleground. Now they were a testament to what had been built, a garden that nourished not just the soil, but the people who worked it. "Yes," I said, "let's do it. Let's make this garden something everyone can be proud of." And that was the beginning of the next chapter. From that day on, the Maple Creek Community Garden became a centerpiece of the neighborhood, a place where people came together, not just to plant food, but to plant hope. The vegetables we grew fed more than just our bodies. They fed our souls. The work didn't end, and neither did the challenges, but we were building something better. A community that worked in harmony. A place where differences were set aside, where people could put their hands in the dirt and find common ground. As for me, the lessons I had learned were hard-won, but they shaped everything I did from then on. Lesson from the story: persistence pays off. The story teaches us that when faced with overwhelming adversity, persistence is key. I could have given up when the HOA issued citations, stole my crops, and tried to destroy my farm, but I chose to stand my ground. The fight wasn't easy, but the rewards, both personal and communal, were far beyond what I initially imagined. Even when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable, continuing to push forward made all the difference. Power of community. One of the most profound lessons of this story is the strength found in community. What started as an isolated individual struggle eventually led to the creation of something far greater, a community garden that not only helped me, but also brought together neighbors who once considered me an outsider. By choosing to engage, to communicate, and to invite others into the process, I transformed a battleground into a place of connection, forgiveness, and moving forward. Although it was hard to forgive those who had tried to take my farm, including members of the HOA, I learned that moving forward was more important than holding on to the past. When I accepted the role of overseeing the community garden, it wasn't just about the position. It was about showing that forgiveness and collaboration could bring about real, lasting change. Sometimes, the best way to heal wounds is to build something together. The value of standing up for what's right. This story reinforces the idea that standing up for your rights and for what's important, whether it's your land, your family, or your values, is never wrong. Even when it seems like the entire world is against you, standing tall and defending what matters can lead to unexpected victories. It's about more than just winning a battle. It's about ensuring that your principles are respected and that you create a lasting legacy. Small steps lead to big change. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started with a few people gathering, learning, and working together. Each small act of planting, each conversation, each community meal contributed to a greater change. Sometimes the key to making a big impact is taking small steps, one by one, until they add up to something truly transformative. In the end, the farm wasn't just a place to grow food, it became a place to grow community, hope, and healing. The lessons I learned during this journey stay with me every day, reminding me that sometimes the most valuable things in life are those that require the most effort to cultivate. And just like a garden, the fruits of that effort can nourish and sustain not just ourselves, but those around us.